Good morning, everybody. Two things, I guess. After watching those fantastic presentations, hope everybody had their yogurt and milk today. I think it's just showing we're at the tip of the iceberg, really, of it, understanding how food and what we consume can affect, our bodies. And I think about the next 25 years where we're going to go linking food and science. From our side. On behalf of dairy management, I work for the dairy farmers, and that's where we're investing a lot in this future space. You talk about lactoferrin, we're just starting to understand things like that. My role, though, unlike my three predecessors, my background is brand marketing and innovation, and I was asked to talk about the COVID-19 and the food supply disruption. So what I want to do is just hit some highlights of what happened in the U.S. with some storytelling here, and then just get to let you guys get to questions. And so I'll call it about March 17th was D-Day last year when the U.S. shut down, and we call it 4 weeks of chaos that occurred in the U.S. supply chain. And I'm going to focus really on the dairy elements of the supply chain. Dairy Farmers of America is the biggest co-op here in the U.S. And when COVID hit, you had mass chaos within the food industry and I'll talk about, I wanted to lead with the impact, and I'll talk about the whys. But they were dumping about 3.7 million gallons of milk back on the farm as we got the supply chain reorganized to handle the disruption. What we did as an industry, we formed what we call these emergency action teams to focus on, how do we make sure that the kids are getting the right nutrition, since the schools shut down and people were getting educated at home. The hunger channel, we had a massive increase in food insecurity with people not working. And then the disruptions of food service, where you had shut down, to give an example, you think about dine-in restaurants where 35 to 100% of their businesses is relied on dine-in, shut down. Where does all that volume of products that go through that channel? And then vice versa, you had retail and grocery had 50 to 75% increase in consumption. So we'll talk about the chain reaction to all this complexity and how the industry rapidly got together to figure out how they moved different packaging of products around to meet these needs and changes. And I always like to think, sometimes we take advantage or take for granted the food system and how products move through the food system. So I just grabbed some slides to talk about that. When you think about from ingredient, it moves, milk comes in a tanker, it goes to whether it's a manufacturer or a distributor, and gets processed. And then whether it goes to retail, hospitals, universities, and the distributors that can handle that market, hotels, to, the restaurant industry, whether it's a quick serve, fast casual, or fine dining, and then these smaller individual local places. So you've got a lot of products moving different sizes and packaging. And you've got emerging technologies out there, whether it's like the meal kits or I'll call it delivery companies that are popping up to get the food to the consumer. So, and that created, when COVID hit, packaging, what I called conundrums, where you have immediate oversupply because of the changing of the consumer environment, and then also immediate scarcity. So put that in perspective. When you think about schools, in the US, we have 1 billion packages and cartons that go through the school environment. Again, all these kids were not in school anymore, they're at home. And vice versa, you had people who weren't working. Again, you had massive growth in at-home consumption. And so, from a 50 to 75% spike, people weren't planning changes in their supply chain here. When you look at food service and sour cream as an example, you have 5-gallon tubs that are designed for distribution to food service. Retail, you had massive runs on your normal 8 to 12 to 16 ounce type of products. So what do you do with all this excess tubs of sour cream that have 30-day supply, 21-day supply, or on the shelf, when they're not sellable marked, that they're not, I'll call it FDA approved to sell at retail, and people aren't buying 5 pounds at the retails for their home use. So just a lot of challenges there in the food system. So then third, you think about cheese. You've got cheese designed for food service, backroom preparation, whether it's Italian, Mexican channel, different types of food service entities. What do you do with all that? Then retail, you have, again, a 50 to 75% run up of product. And then you think about the complexity of cheese, you also have a lot of custom packaged cheese. You know, when you think about aged cheddar 90 days, you get a 75% lift. You just can't add 90 days of aging to meet that. And so you also run into to supply and production issues pretty quickly due to the aging process. And then you know, over the decades, there's been a lot of, for mass efficiency, packaging systems designed for optimization across channels. You know, I just grabbed milk. Whether it's a restaurant, the C-store, or healthcare, et cetera, you've got all these, it's customized over the time, and the same thing with other types of packaging. So you've got this packaging effect of increased demand in some channels and dramatically declines in demands in others. And when you think about fluid milk, prior to COVID, just put it in perspective, in the U.S., 5 billion gallons, what is that about? 3 billion liters, something like that. And 75% had already gone through retail, but you had schools, which is 8%, restaurants, another 8%, other types of food service like hotels make, that makes up a quarter. So you had one section of the world seeing a dramatic increase, and others, dramatic declines. And then I thought this was when you think about milk, so you go through, overall milk was flat, in the US last year. But then if you're trying to manage the packaging, you're trying to manage the channels and package size, and you retail, again, over 600 million gallon increase. And then schools, a 400 million gallon decline. And then all others, again, also declined. And so, just a dramatic pressure on supply chains, giving a very short shelf life product. How do you manage through that? So there's a lot of complexity. Like we don't want to dump it. So like I said, the first 4 weeks was chaos, but over time we worked across the industry to say, how do we take the school demand and meet with new types of package systems for retail, and also incorporate where that increased demand is in hunger. I'm just going to give you some highlights when you start to then break down the channels. When you look at COVID's impact to restaurants, both global and in the US, they almost mirrored each other. So the top bucket is, the restaurant sales demand at, from Australia to Mexico to the UK, everything was pretty consistent. You just saw this almost at dining in restaurants immediately drop off. So it put a lot of that restaurant-focused packaging that is not labeled for retail sale, and all those products with short shelf lives out there in a quagmire. And then, the bottom is the US, and just again showed this drop where we've seen, and we still haven't completely recovered in the US and globally. And then from a big picture food service, I mean, you've had decades of decline of growth and sales, and all of a sudden you see, again, just an extraordinary decline of volume. And so, the job impacts that it impacted in the U.S., supply, and again, just chaos in the food industry chain. And then you have, I call, winners and losers. And when you start to fragment the category, the winners in food at restaurants were set for digital. Like when you look at players like a Domino's, who've got a dramatic application system, on their phone, that whether it's set up for delivery, set up for carry out, or like a McDonald's or the Paneras of the world, or like a Chick-fil-A here in the U.S., where they're set up for delivery drive-through. They succeeded and maintained growth. But if you look at these casual and fine dining, where they have, the individual proprietor hasn't invested as much into delivery systems and carry out systems and I'll call it new digital technology, they just were crushed. So then if you're a dairy manufacturer in the US that were, doing fresh mozzarella for a fine dining Italian restaurant, you had and you just produced 30 days of supply, and your restaurant industry shut down, that was a big quagmire here in the US. Shifting to the retail, and this is where you saw the opposite. When you look at this is a fluid milk at retail, we were averaging about 5% decline. And what's happening with fluid milk is, really, 30% of the declines are tied to cereal consumption. Cereal's declining because people are eating away from home, eating high protein bowls, etc., or bars. Other things, just competitive beverages. So you're drinking it in your coffee and your creamers. So that was the historic declines, and it's easy to forecast and plan. When COVID hit, everybody's at home again. They're eating cereal again. They're actually baking more, and drinking more at home. And those kids who were in school, who were, getting the little cartons, were at home. They're starting to drink gallons. And so this is just, you can see the immediate spikes for the first, 2 to 4 weeks. And then, as I talked about the inverse relationship with milk and cereal, I overlaid the graph of the cold cereal demand to the fluid milk demand, and you can see a big spike, and it's linear, of consumers at home, the rebuying and reutilization of cold cereal, and what it's done for fluid milk during the COVID period. And then, this is when we get into the aging process. You look at aged cheese, natural cheese. Similar, natural cheese was pretty flat prior to COVID. At that, the first 3 months of the year, 74% increase, and cheese held because people were cooking at home at dinner versus going out for restaurants, and that 14% increase on a yearly basis. And then you talk about another thing is shifting how consumers buy the product. So historically, people would go and walk into the store. Less than, in the US, less than 25% of consumers had bought groceries online, and whether to drive and pick up or just to have delivered to their house. When COVID hit, over 55% of the consumers bought online, and so they used new delivery methods and new pickup methods to do that. So again, the industry is like, you're seeing people order maybe more gallons and go into the stores less. So it changed, and again, a lot of the packaging pressure and production pressure in the system. So when you look at e-commerce, we were averaging prior to COVID, on the dairy front, around 50 to 70%. Post-COVID, over 3 times growth behind that. And then hunger. Looking at the hunger channel, and you see here in the U.S. around 15 to 20% of food had been consistently food insecure, which is never a good thing. But when COVID, you saw dramatic segments of the population all of a sudden get impacts. I'll talk about that, what that did on the next slide. Is, you've got 37 million households, and we've got programs here we call it SNAP, and then our food banks are set up, and they're set up to handle, weekend distribution and things like that on a national basis. And I think there's about 90,000 food banks in the U.S. COVID, again, a 17 million households. So, what is that? Close to 40% increase in demand. Just in last year, that resulted in 1 billion pounds of additional fluid milk demand through that system. So you think about where that last mile of food banks, it is usually distributed through, whether it's a church, a school, or a very small food center where they've got maybe 2 refrigerators, industrial refrigerators. When you got 1 billion pounds going through that system, it created chaos for them. The government was buying to help meet this additional food insecure. The industry was donating to meet this food insecure, but then the food hunger system didn't have the capability to do that. So there's a lot of partnering taking place to try to meet that demand. So just to put that in visual perspective, that additional 17 million people, this is the picture on the left, is just how the food was distributed in the US. And so again, try to get healthy, nutritious food, and not just dairy, but think about produce across the US that's used to a much more normalized system. And so you had lines miles long to get food in the US, and it created a huge challenge to get nutritious food. The boxed, et cetera, only deliver so much health versus the higher levels of produce and dairy and other proteins. So this picture on the right is an example of what a normal, they may have 3 or 4 of these max at some of these food banks, and then yet they got an additional 1 billion pounds of just milk. That doesn't include dairy, that doesn't include other produce that was bought. And so it just created a chaos in a system that wasn't really attuned to handling much mass refrigeration. And I think, with the government's looking at now, how do we build that last mile infrastructure for the future, and to meet demands for hunger system. And then talking about schools, the schools really, to at-home learning, created the need to, how do you get quality, the cold food that's distributed at schools safely to kids to go home and eat. So think about, a significant portion of the U.S. actually eats breakfast at schools and lunch at schools, but they were on a daily basis. And so we worked to help build systems within the school nutrition alliances in the U.S. to try to, everything from waivers. So like I said, daily the kids are getting the little milk cartons, to letting parents come in and take gallons home that will last them a couple of days. So it makes it easier for the parents, makes it easier to distribute the foods. Number two, on equipment, we've secured and worked with other agencies that we have relationships with to do equipment funding to provide things over here to the right, like portable coolers that they can distribute the milk to the kids to take home, and also like their lunches and sandwiches. And so there was the industry put not just dairy, but the whole, I'll call it the whole food secure systems. How do we make sure we're keeping youth fed? And in these major metros, if the schools aren't feeding, the kids have a lot of at risk. So we talked about 54 million youth in society that became food insecure. If the schools aren't providing the foods, there's a lot of concern about the kids getting the right nutrition to grow, et cetera, and to learn. So that's why it was so important as an industry across these areas, where we had excess foods in the food service world. We looked at, are there ways to repack some of those excess foods and or donate them to the hunger channel, or reprocess it for the schools channel, so we can make sure that a big portion of society is getting fed. So that's some of the key takeaways there. And from a total U.S. dairy impact, when we talk about the massive movement across channels, what's really interesting is, we still witness dairy consumption growth. I know my friends on the plant-based side like to tell the story that they're growing X%, but I said, when you got a $100 billion category, 1% growth is $1 billion of growth. So it's just, we're still seeing nice growth, and we've had historic growth both domestically and internationally. So I thought I'd wrap it up and just say, the growth came through massive, and I'll call it partnerships, to move products across different channels in a new way. And again, our focus was making sure these channels got food to those most in need, whether it's the hunger side or the youth side in schools. And then, retail and food service were more packaging systems that we knew would come back in the long term.